North Korea just handed Russia a weapons pipeline that was supposed to change the calculus on the Eastern Front. That is the headline. That is what the press covered, what the analysts summarized in 2 paragraphs, and what most viewers absorbed and moved on from. But here is what that framing misses entirely. Kim Jong Un did not give Putin a lifeline, he gave him a dependency. And the distinction between those two things is the difference between a short-term tactical patch and a long-term structural catastrophe for Russian military power. What you are witnessing right now is not an alliance strengthening Russia's hand. It is a transaction that is quietly, systematically, and irreversibly compounding every foundational miscalculation Russia made when it launched this war. The shells arrived, the soldiers arrived, and with them came something Pyongyang never advertised on the invoice: leverage, exposure, and the slow transfer of Russian strategic agency to a regime that answers to no one in Moscow. Let that sink in for a moment. Russia, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a country that spent decades projecting itself as a self-sufficient military superpower, is now battlefield dependent on artillery ammunition produced in one of the most sanctioned, isolated, and economically broken states on earth. And that is not a sign of strength. That is a confession. And the confession has consequences that will outlast this war by decades. Before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened in that transaction, but why it was always going to backfire, why Kim Jong Un structured it to extract maximum value from Russian weakness, and why what looks like cooperation from the outside is, at the operational and strategic level, a slow-motion catastrophe for Russian military capacity. Pull the lens back and the picture becomes very clear. To understand why this arrangement is structurally fatal for Russia, you have to understand the assumption that made it feel necessary. When Russian planners designed the 2022 invasion, they operated on a foundational premise. This would be a short war. Kyiv would fall in days. Ukrainian resistance would collapse under the weight of conventional Russian combined arms pressure. The stockpiles needed would be modest. The international response would be fragmented. And Russian industry, already operating under years of sanctions pressure, would never need to shift into genuine wartime production footing because the war would be over before the shortfall became visible. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong, and the wrongness was not marginal, it was categorical. Ukraine did not collapse. NATO cohesion did not fracture in the first weeks. The war did not end in days. It expanded into a grinding, high-intensity artillery duel that began consuming Russian ammunition reserves at a rate that Soviet-era planning models never anticipated for this kind of sustained operational tempo. Russian factories, structured around peacetime margins and constrained by Western component dependencies that sanctions had already begun strangling, could not simply flip a switch and produce at the volume the front demanded. By late 2023, the arithmetic was impossible to ignore from the outside, which means it was impossible to ignore from inside the Russian general staff long before that. Ukraine was receiving Western artillery support. Russian tube artillery was firing at rates that were burning through reserves faster than domestic production could replace them. The decision to turn to North Korea was not a strategic choice born from confidence. It was an emergency procurement driven by a production shortfall that Russian planners never planned for because they never planned for a long war. And Kim Jong Un, watching from Pyongyang, understood exactly what that desperation meant. Here is the first thing mainstream coverage consistently gets wrong about this arrangement. It frames the North Korea-Russia weapons transfer as a bilateral partnership, as though two sovereign states with aligned interests struck a mutually beneficial deal. That framing is incorrect at the operational level. What actually happened is closer to a creditor-debtor relationship in which the debtor has already surrendered the strongest negotiating cards. Russia came to Pyongyang. Russia needed the shells. Russia needed the bodies. Russia was operating under time pressure because the front does not pause for procurement delays. Kim Jong Un faced none of those pressures. He had stockpiles he could not use for conventional war without triggering immediate regime-ending retaliation. He had a surplus military labor pool trained for a war his country cannot fight unilaterally. And he had something he had spent his entire leadership tenure desperately seeking: a great power patron willing to exchange technology, sanctions cover, and international legitimacy for battlefield materiel. The hidden military variable here is not the ammunition count. The shells matter, but they are not the decisive element. The decisive element is what Russia agreed to transfer in exchange: advanced missile technology, satellite reconnaissance access, nuclear submarine technical knowledge, space launch cooperation. These are not peripheral concessions. These are the core components of a ballistic missile and delivery system development program that every serious Western security analyst has spent years trying to slow down. Russia just accelerated it in exchange for artillery rounds. Pull the lens back. Russia did not buy ammunition. Russia sold strategic leverage at a discount to a regime whose primary security interest, developing a credible intercontinental nuclear delivery capability, runs directly counter to every security guarantee the international system depends on. That is not a partnership. That is a fire sale conducted under battlefield duress. Now let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level, because the numbers matter here, and the numbers are damning. Estimates from Western intelligence assessments and open source munitions tracking place the North Korean artillery ammunition transfer in the range of 2 to 4 million rounds over the course of the arrangement. At peak Ukrainian counter-battery intensity, Russian forces on certain front sectors were firing in excess of 20,000 rounds per day. The North Korean supply provided a buffer. There is no credible argument otherwise. At certain moments in late 2023 and into 2024, that buffer was operationally significant. But here is what the round count alone obscures. North Korean ammunition is not NATO standard. It is not even Russian standard at the quality control level that Russian artillery systems were calibrated to expect. Documented reports from Ukrainian forces, from Western intelligence assessments, and from physical examination of unexploded ordnance on the battlefield consistently point to elevated dud rates, barrel wear acceleration caused by powder inconsistencies, and propellant degradation in shells that had been sitting in storage conditions far below what operational artillery doctrine requires. Some of the ammunition was decades old. Some of it had been stored in facilities that lacked the humidity and temperature controls that long-term artillery shell storage demands. This matters doctrinally in a way that most coverage never explains. Artillery is not just a matter of shells in a tube. It is a precision system in which propellant burn rates, shell weight, and barrel wear interact to determine the accuracy of the firing solution. When you introduce propellant inconsistency at scale, you do not simply get slightly less accurate artillery. You get a degradation of the entire targeting chain because fire control calculations assume consistent ballistic behavior. You also get accelerated barrel erosion, which shortens the service life of artillery pieces that Russia is already having difficulty replacing. Russia did not simply import ammunition. It imported a degradation multiplier into its own fire support systems, and it gets even more serious from here. The North Korean troop deployment is where the strategic picture shifts from bad to structurally dangerous for Russian long-term military capacity. Estimates from South Korean intelligence, corroborated by Ukrainian battlefield reporting, place the number of North Korean soldiers deployed to Russian territory in the range of 10,000 to 12,000, with some assessments suggesting the number has exceeded that threshold. These forces were reportedly assigned to the Kursk Oblast area following Ukraine's cross-border incursion, and they have taken casualties. Significant casualties by some accounts. Here is the doctrinal lesson embedded in that deployment that the mainstream analysis consistently underweights. Kim Jong Un did not send these soldiers as a favor. He sent them as a training investment. The Korean People's Army has not fought a modern high-intensity war since 1953. It has trained, drilled, posture signaled, and prepared for a conflict that involves weapon systems, battlefield communications, drone warfare, counter-battery radar, and electronic warfare environments that simply did not exist during the last time North Korean soldiers were in actual combat. Every month, those soldiers spend on a modern contested battlefield against a NATO-equipped and NATO-advised opponent is a month of irreplaceable operational data flowing back to Pyongyang. Russia just funded the modernization of the Korean People's Army's institutional combat knowledge in exchange for ammunition and manpower it needed to plug a hole in Kursk. Kim Jong Un paid for a live-fire advanced warfare training program using Russian logistics, Russian command exposure, and Russian battlefield casualties as the tuition cost. Russia did not gain an ally in this transaction. It trained a future strategic complication. Pull the lens back further, and the pattern becomes even more consequential. What is happening in the industrial and economic dimension of this arrangement is a case study in how desperation-driven procurement decisions compound existing vulnerabilities rather than resolving them. Russia's defense industrial base entered this war already operating under significant constraints. Sanctions had cut off access to Western microelectronics, precision manufacturing equipment, and the dual-use technology that modern weapon systems require at every level, from guidance packages to communications encryption. The workarounds Russia developed, routing imports through third-country intermediaries, stripping civilian electronics for components, accepting lower-grade substitutes, were functional patches that reduce capability quality without eliminating production entirely. The North Korea arrangement sits on top of those existing constraints and adds a new one, dependency. Russia's frontline artillery fire support posture is now partially contingent on a supply chain that runs through Pyongyang, crosses the Russian-North Korean border, and traverses thousands of kilometers of Russian rail infrastructure before reaching the front. That supply chain has exactly one critical node that Russia does not control, and that node is a regime governed by a 21st century hereditary autocrat whose decision-making is opaque, whose domestic stability is non-trivial to assess, and who has every incentive to keep Russia dependent rather than to help Russia resolve the underlying production shortfall. Western countermeasures are also not static. The United States, South Korea, Japan, and European partners have all formally documented the arms transfers, which creates both a diplomatic record and a policy basis for escalating secondary sanctions pressure on North Korean trading partners and on the Russian entities facilitating the transfers. The financial architecture that allows Pyongyang to receive value from this arrangement, whether in currency, technology, or deferred geopolitical concessions, is a target. It will be targeted. And every time Western pressure tightens around that financial architecture, Russia's ability to sustain the ammunition import pipeline becomes more complicated, not less. The question was always whether this arrangement could serve as a genuine long-term substitute for Russian domestic production capacity. The answer, examined from a supply chain, quality control, and geopolitical dependency standpoint, is clearly no. It is a delay mechanism dressed as a solution, and the Russians who understand logistics at the senior staff level know it. Now, let me bring you to the moment that crystallizes what this arrangement actually means for the trajectory of Russian strategic power. The Kursk incursion was a moment of acute operational crisis for Russian military planning. Ukraine crossed into sovereign Russian territory, seized ground, held it under contested conditions, and forced a Russian response that required redeployment of forces from other front sectors, emergency mobilization of units that were supposed to be in reserve, and critically, the deployment of North Korean troops to an area inside Russia itself. Read that again. North Korean soldiers are operating inside Russian Federation territory in a conflict that Russian official communications still describe domestically as a limited special military operation rather than a full-scale war requiring Allied ground forces. The political and informational implications of that reality are severe and compounding. Russian domestic messaging depends on projecting the image of a self-sufficient military conducting a controlled, purposeful campaign. The visible presence of North Korean soldiers on Russian soil, a fact that South Korean intelligence has confirmed, that Ukrainian forces have corroborated with captured soldiers and documents, and that Western governments have formally acknowledged, directly contradicts that messaging architecture. Every Russian citizen who learns that Allied foreign troops are required to defend Kursk has received information that fractures the foundational narrative of Russian military capability. And the fracture is not just informational, it is doctrinal. The reason the Kursk deployment required North Korean troops was that Russia did not have sufficient trained, available forces to seal the breach at the speed operational necessity demanded. That is a readiness statement. That is an assessment of the actual condition of the Russian military's reserve and rotation system after more than 2 years of high-intensity attrition. The deployment did not solve the readiness problem. It masked it using externally sourced manpower while the underlying attrition dynamic continued. Ukrainian forces, for their part, conducted the Kursk incursion with exactly that logic in mind. The operation was not designed primarily for territorial gain. It was designed as a pressure instrument, force Russia to redeploy, expose the fragility of Russian border defense, compel the use of reserves across multiple sectors simultaneously, and generate the conditions under which the North Korean dependency became a visible and politically costly emergency measure rather than a quietly managed procurement arrangement. In that sense, Ukraine's strategic thinking demonstrated precisely the doctrinal sophistication that this channel has documented repeatedly. They understood the Russian system better than Russian planners understood the risk they were running. Pull the lens back one final time. What Kim Jong Un extracted from Vladimir Putin in this transaction is a masterclass in asymmetric negotiating from a position of apparent weakness. North Korea was isolated, sanctioned, and economically hollowed out. Russia was desperate, under operational pressure, and willing to pay. The price Russia paid was not simply shells and soldiers. The price was advanced military technology, satellite access, nuclear and missile development acceleration, diplomatic cover, and the precedent that Moscow's great power posture is available for purchase when the battlefield demands it. That precedent has consequences that extend well beyond the Korean Peninsula and well beyond this war. Every future adversary of Russia now has data confirming that sustained conventional attrition can force Russian strategic concessions at a level previous analysts would have assessed as unthinkable. Every future security arrangement Russia attempts to anchor on its great power credibility will carry this transaction as an asterisk. The country that came to Pyongyang with its handout is not the same country that projected invulnerability in 2022. History will record this not as a successful emergency procurement. It will record it as the moment the gap between Russian strategic posture and Russian strategic reality became impossible to manage with information operations alone. The shells bought time. The technology transfers bought a long-term adversary, a generational capability upgrade. The troop deployment trained a foreign army on Russian casualties. And the dependency, the structural, operational, supply chain dependency on North Korea, will not end when the artillery contracts expire. Russia needed a lifeline, and Kim Jong Un handed them a leash. That is the real story of what happened here. Not the headline, not the round counts, not the troop numbers. The story is that Russia's foundational assumptions about its own military capacity, its industrial sufficiency, its strategic self-reliance have failed so completely that the emergency measures required to compensate have introduced new strategic vulnerabilities faster than the old ones are being resolved. The broader lesson is not about North Korea. The broader lesson is about what happens when a military machine built on authoritarian industrial mythology meets a modern, adaptive, Western-supported opponent with the will and the institutional intelligence to exploit every gap between Russian doctrine and Russian reality. Ukraine did not create this dependency. Russian planning created it. Ukraine simply held the line long enough for the cracks to become load-bearing failures. Stay with us, because the next phase of this equation is already developing. The questions about how Russia manages this dependency, how Kim Jong Un escalates his demands as Russian need persists, and what Western countermeasure architecture looks like as this arrangement matures, those questions do not have simple answers, but they have strategic answers. And that is exactly what we are here to work through.